Hey everyone, and welcome again to the SQL course. So here in this lecture we are going to set up MySQL on our machines. This is a tutorial for Windows, but I'll leave some links in the resources to install in Mac or Linux. So as I've said, MySQL is a completely free and open source software, so we'll be able to use it with no charge. The only thing that we need to install MySQL is internet access so that we are able to download the softwares. So here in your computer, go to Google Chrome or Firefox or whatever, and go to a search engine page so that we can search for the MySQL download page. Then we'll download MySQL and install it and set it up immediately in our machine. Okay, so here in Google, let's hit MySQL download. This will take us to these pages and we can hit the first one, MySQL downloads. The first link should be the one where you will find the MySQL download. After installing, we are able to interact with MySQL in two ways. Either by the interactive interface, the IDE, which is the one that we'll use more often, or at least we'll always use that for the rest of the course. And we'll also have the command line. This is a bit more advanced, and if you are not familiar with command lines, don't worry about that because that's not relevant for the rest of the course. That will not interfere at all with learning SQL. Okay, so probably here you'll have these cookies. This is an Oracle company right now. If you are here in the cookies, just use whatever preference you want. I'm going to use accept all in this case. And now you'll go here to MySQL community downloads. Okay, go here to this part, MySQL community downloads, because this is where we are going to download the community version. So here in MySQL community downloads, go to MySQL installer for Windows. And here we should go to this page where we have the MySQL installer. We can select operating system. Right now it's only Windows. Again, I'll leave some resources for Mac or Linux. And then here, just go to this version that has 400 or around 400 megabytes. Download the bigger one, or at least the bigger file. And then here you can just hit no thanks, just start my download. Okay, no need to log in at all. Of course, this is a technique by Oracle for you to create an account, but you don't need to create it. So just go and continue with the download. And then let's just make here a small wait until the download finishes, and then we'll go to our downloads folder where we'll have this file that we can use to basically install MySQL locally in our computer. Okay, so MySQL download just finished. So let's go to our downloads folder, and here on the downloads you'll see here where it is, MySQL installer community. This is the community version. Of course, it's the free version of MySQL. So MySQL also has paid implementations, but that's for corporations, not for users. Or for individual users. So hit 2 times on this MySQL installer, on MySQL installer community, and the version that you are working on. Depending on the time where you are doing this course, this version may change. Just hit it 2 times, and then Windows will start to install the MySQL server and Workbench in your computer. Okay, so when you are running the MySQL installer, sometimes you may have this message of error that's going to show up right now, which is this application requires .NET Framework 4.5.2. Please install this .NET Framework to run this installer again. This depends on your system and what .NET Framework from Windows you have on your computer. If you have this issue, just go to Google Chrome, hit .NET 4.5.2 download, or the version that MySQL is asking for. Go to the first link, which will usually be a Microsoft link. Okay, so make sure that it's a Microsoft link and you are not downloading from any other source that's not an official one, at least. And wait for the page to open. I'll also leave, in this case, this page in the resources. And then here, just go to the framework that you want. In this case, we want the 4.5.2. You hit, in this case, download. Okay. After you hit download, you'll see here that the download should start in a moment. Okay, this will be a small file just to install this framework. In this case, it's a 66 megabytes file. Let's wait for it to finish, and then we'll install this .NET framework so that we can install MySQL. If this error did not occur to you, just skip this part, but I'm showing something that is super common to occur when you are trying to install MySQL, and I'm doing it in a completely clean environment, which probably there are students out there that also have this clean environment, or at least an environment that doesn't have this .NET framework updated. Okay, cool. So our framework, or our .NET framework installer already finished. We'll go here and you'll see this file, or confirm that it's the file that you've downloaded in the .NET framework, click yes here when you are trying to launch this, if you have this pop-up, and then just wait a bit for this to install. So here read the terms of acceptance and then accept them and click install. This will install this .NET framework that will be needed for our MySQL. Okay, so the .NET will finish installing. It may take a while depending on your system. Okay, so when it finishes installing, if you are going through this process, just hit finish. Now let me go here again to the MySQL installer and let's install then the community version. And now our installer should work and go forward because we have already all the requisites that we need in Windows. Remember, if you have this pop-up, just hit yes, and then MySQL installer will launch. Okay, so here we are in the window for installing MySQL. Here, just hit developer default. That should be the one that's enough for this course, and also the one that has the most important applications for using MySQL. Then hit next. So now here, if some of the products have this requirement, click on top of each of the products and then hit execute. That will start some install process either for dependencies and the product itself. And on the side, MySQL will launch new installers for each of the dependencies of each of the softwares that will install, okay, after you hit execute. So this will be some packages that are needed, particularly regarding libraries in Microsoft. I know that this seems a process that's a bit cumbersome, but that's because the products from MySQL have certain dependencies that need to be installed. So here, when you have these products, for example, this one, just hit install, close it. You'll see that you'll start to have here more processes that you can do. But for example, this was the only dependency that was not installed in my computer. So after I installed that Microsoft Visual C++ package that was needed, after hitting execute, now I have all of these packages available and I can just hit next. Okay, so don't do next without doing the execute and installing every software that MySQL is asking, okay, on the side. You'll see new windows popping up if you need that. Just make sure that when you hit next, okay, now one or more products requirements have not been satisfied, click yes, but just make sure that when you are on this window, after hitting next, that you have here MySQL Workbench and MySQL Server and also MySQL Shell. So these are the three most important products that we will use. These ones must be on this list right here. If you don't have them, go return. And when you are on this window, you'll have here the products where you need to install some dependencies. Do that with the execute command, and then only after that, only after having sure that you have these products right here in the installation, you can go forward, click execute, and our software will start to install, or at least our different softwares will start to install. So another important thing while this is installing is to differentiate between the MySQL Server, MySQL Workbench, MySQL Shell, for example, and SQL. So SQL is a language, okay? SQL is what we are going to code on. It's the language that we are going to use to code, and it's an acronym for Structured Query Language. We can use SQL in multiple softwares. In this case, we need to have a database server in our machine, the MySQL server, so that we can manipulate tables back and forth in our computer. Then we need the MySQL Workbench, because the MySQL Workbench will be the software that we'll use to code. So that's where we are going to write our code, and our SQL code will be interpreted and send commands to our server. Okay, so that's what the Workbench is going to do. We'll see it in a minute. Then we have the shell. In this case, if you want to access via command line to your SQL server, you can do it using MySQL Shell. And then you have here other products that are basically connectivity products and also documentation products that are cool to have also and to install when you install MySQL. Okay, so these four concepts are different. SQL is the language. Okay, MySQL Workbench is the software that we use to access the server, which is the MySQL server, and then the MySQL Shell is what we can also use instead of the Workbench to communicate with our server. So the Workbench is much more cooler because we have an interactive interface where we can click on buttons and also send commands. So it has a front end, while the shell doesn't have a front end. Okay, that's the main difference. Both of them access the MySQL server, which is what interprets and reads SQL code. Okay, just to put these concepts separate and for you not to get confused at this stage, but all of these will be relevant. The shell not so much, but we can install it, but the other ones, SQL, the Workbench and the server, are essential for us to continue with the course. Okay, So let me also know if you are having any trouble installing any of these softwares. I know that this is not a straightforward install process where you just click 2 buttons and install and that's it, because MySQL has a lot of dependencies, but even so, it shouldn't be hard to install this software. Okay, so after all of these softwares installed, just hit next. You may notice that I've changed the machine where I was working on because MySQL was having a bit of trouble in the virtual machine that I was doing a clean install because of the Windows version. I had a Windows 8 version, so a pretty old Windows version on that Windows machine. That's also a learning. If you have those versions on your machine, probably you'll have more issues installing MySQL. So Windows versions older than Windows 10, for example. Okay, now we need to configure the server mainly. That's what we are going to do here in the installer. I'm going to hit next, and here we can do a configuration type. Makes sense for you to use development computer for instance. Then just keep this as default. Okay, everything that you see right here, click next. Authentication method, leave use strong password encryption. Okay, and then just define a password that you remember, of course, that will be used for you to connect to the server, to the MySQL server every time we want to work with SQL. So I'm going to hit my password here. I'll hit check. Remember that this password must be something that you remember so that you may be able to use it when you are working with MySQL, because you'll need to type this password to connect to your local server. Okay, so after the check is done, we can hit next. And then you have here Windows service name for MySQL. You can configure MySQL as a Windows service. You can uncheck probably start MySQL at Windows startup, at system startup, because if you are not going to work with MySQL every time you log into your computer, it doesn't make sense for this to be checked. And then run Windows Server. You can use standard system account, which is the recommended for most scenarios. Hit next and execute all these configurations. Okay, so these configurations will enable us to connect to our local server every time we want to talk with data that we have on that local server. You'll understand this when we work with MySQL, particularly in the first lectures. Okay, so finish, and you can hit next now. This will have the router configuration. Just hit finish. No, it's not relevant. And TCP server also here. Just introducing the password, your password, the one that you've defined before. Hit check. You'll see that the connection is succeeded. This is just a test to see if everything is set up in your computer. Hit next and execute. And now this will apply the configuration to the server. Okay, so after this, we'll be ready to start to code in SQL using the MySQL Workbench. Finish. Let's hit next, of course. And now you can do start MySQL Workbench after setup. I'll leave both of these checks on so that we have both MySQL Workbench and MySQL Shell for you to check. Let's hit finish, and there you go. Okay, so both softwares just popped up. This is MySQL Shell. This is where we can use SQL code directly in a command line type of interface. Let's not open MySQL Shell again in this course. This will not use this interface, okay? But if you want, if you are already aware of how command lines work and you want to experiment a bit, you can use Shell all the time. Of course, that's a personal choice. I'm going to close MySQL Shell, and there you go. We have here MySQL Workbench. This is the software and the interface that we will use to do everything here in this course. Here from this window, I can use this connection right here, local. I'm going to connect it, and you can see that this is already asking for my password. I'm going to put my password, the one that I've set before, and do OK. And now MySQL will open, as you can see. So super cool, we have here all the interface that we need. This is where we are going to code in SQL inside this script file. Okay, so this is what we commonly call a script file, and this is where we are going to type our SQL code. So select all from something. Of course, these are statements that we are going to learn in a minute, but this is our interface to code in SQL. Every time we'll do something here in SQL, we'll communicate with the server, so the SQL server that we've just installed that contains these databases. Of course, these databases have already been created by me for the course, and you probably have less. Okay, so this is it for loading MySQL. This is the window that we will use. Okay, you have here several stuff that we'll explore also when we need. We'll not need much of these options right here. Okay, so because we'll mostly need everything that we have here. I'll also explain the divisions that we have, for example, what's this output and the log for the errors and all that in subsequent lectures. This was just for you to have MySQL up and running in your system. That's it for this lecture. In the next lecture, we are going to see how we can create the database that we'll use throughout this course, or at least through most of this course, which is the Sequila database. And in the next lecture, I'll explain how you can create this on your site. Super simple, just 2 clicks and an execute button. Okay, so we're almost ready to start coding in SQL. I'll see you in the next lecture.